So this marks part 8 of the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus. I think we have about 14 pages left to go. I would imagine we'd probably make this into 10 parts. Now I was thinking how to reintroduce this dialogue to start a new episode. And given that it's been 7 parts, it's going to be quite difficult. I mean, each part is it's 2 hours or more. That's a lot of time and a lot of different thoughts to explore. And so I thought I would do my best to give perhaps a small summary of where we have just been. And then a few comments perhaps on knowing and where my thoughts are on this matter. But to be brief, we've been talking about this analogy of the mind and of knowing to that of an aviary, which is full of pigeons, and that each individual pigeon is a piece of knowledge. Now we hunt for this knowledge in our everyday lives, and it is said that when we find a pigeon, we have it, when we capture it, and we put it in this aviary. Now when we leave, we close the aviary door, we go about our day, and it's not at the front of our conscious mind, it's not explicit to us anymore. We still possess that knowledge, but we don't quite have it. And so there is this difference between this having and possessing. The possessing is more of a long-term relationship, although in the absence of this having, which is a more transitory, temporary thing, relational to a degree, we are sort of outside of that interaction. And it's when we return to the aviary and we grab one of these pigeons, we hunt for it, and we now have it, then we could then utilize that knowledge for our purposes. And we also were discussing that it is possible to grab a pigeon by mistake and mistake it for another piece of knowledge that we have stored there. And in so doing, we have something called false judgment. Now, prior to this analogy, we were exploring another analogy, a metaphor, that of the ball of wax, being similar to that of our memory. That this ball of wax is a blank slate to a certain degree, that we could chisel in our memories. And the distinctness, the level of detail, is the level at which we can return to that ball of wax and view upon this memory and understand it. Moreover from that, the ball of wax itself, in regards to its constitution, can be smooth and ready for imprintation or imprinting, or it can be of a nature that is too hard, too soft, perhaps irregular in its shape, deformed, dirty, and all of these sorts of things affect the way we choose to retain our memories and to carve it into this wax. We were also discussing an archer. He takes aim at a target, fires his arrow in an attempt to hit the bullseye. And the thing of concern here is the bullseye. And what we take aim at is our attentiveness, our attentive capacity. And the bullseye is the degree to which our attention has allowed us to achieve an appropriate map of reality. And as such, if we have a good map, we have achieved and we have hit the mark, our memories will be all the more retentive and distinct. Now, there is just to bring this into experience and to make this a livable thing, to make this podcast a livable thing, that is something that is concerned with the actual life of a person rather than just an observation of a person or of a mechanism. I often struggle with knowing and memory as we fade in and we fade out of different states of awareness and of perception. I think the primary thing here is the level of attentiveness. And the goal, the game, the objective, is to orient oneself in such a way that they can maximize their attentive capacity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we all have the experience of going to bed and waking up in the morning. Now, in both instances, as we fall asleep, we are becoming less and less attentive to the day at hand, so we're entering into this dream state of unconsciousness. And as we awake from this state, it takes us a period of time before we are able to return. But what are we returning to? We were returning to a state of wakefulness, a state of attentiveness. Now, even within day to day, this level of attentiveness varies. And yet there are practices, no doubt many of us are aware of them, whether it be exercise or reading or having an intimate conversation with a close friend or partner, that we can increase our ability to attend. It is starting the engine of the mind. It is practicing our archery skills, taking aim at the target, releasing our arrows, and doing this multiple times, practicing and perhaps in competition under stressful circumstances to perform, to focus on a target, to attend to something that is a task at hand, to take on a responsibility. But in all cases, the fact remains, at the level of the fundament, that our attention is intimately linked to our experience of reality. The more attentive we are, the more we are able to receive retain knowledge, whether it be in the form of memory, but also in terms of recall. And also, I think we are better individuals for it. We are much more likely to be able to afford what is asked of us if we are able to attend and accurately hit the object of our attention. And it's not just that, because the object of our attention is also of importance. What we choose to attend to, I think, can also have a sort of like a closed loop effect on our desire to attend in the first place. If we are attending to something that is of low value and of low virtue, perhaps this mindless, endless social media scrolling, this is not going to do us any good. It's going to erode our attention. We may be aiming at a mark, but the mark is it's such a eroded, degraded thing that even if we hit the mark, well, perhaps I should say the mark is something that is so broad in this case, in this instance, because it requires so little attention, that to hit it means very little. What we want is a mark that is difficult to hit, so we have to focus and we have to attend to it. Moreover, from that, there has to be an important reason, a point behind us doing it. And back to my own struggle, I often struggle with the pull into the darkness, let's say, or into the fuzziness, into the dilution, into the swamp and the mire. Perhaps we can call it a confused state. We can call it a dulled state of mind, a nullified human being, where I may sit in absence of thought or sit in absence of attention. And I find myself doing this for long periods of time, and by the time I'm aware of it, the thought may cross my mind, and to reorient and to narrow this mark, to narrow this circle, to narrow this target is very difficult. It takes a lot of mental energy to return from the abyss. And so the question is, what do we need to do so that we can find ourselves in a state of being that we are constantly in this place? What does it mean to do it? It seems to me that it requires the constant hunt, constantly hunting for these pigeons of knowledge, constantly retrieving, constantly finding new ones and placing them in our aviary. We may make mistakes along the way. We will make mistakes along the way. But we also learn from our mistakes, our false judgments. But why is it that this idea that the participation in sacrifice and suffering is so difficult for us, even if we know, even if we desire the end result? Why is it so difficult for us to orient our attention, to keep it, to maintain it? Now Socrates says, what is involved in false judgment is going to become a matter of an interchange of pieces of knowledge. He says, to begin with, it follows that a man who has knowledge of something is ignorant of this very thing, not through want of knowledge, but actually in virtue of his knowledge. Secondly, he judges that this is something else, and that the other thing is it. Now surely this is utterly unreasonable. It means that the soul, when knowledge becomes present to it, knows nothing and is wholly ignorant. According to this argument, there is no reason why any accession of ignorance should not make one know something, or of blindness make one see something, if knowledge is ever going to make a man ignorant. So what we see here is the understanding and the belief, perhaps the faith in man's prior efforts to obtain knowledge and to store and to hunt his pigeons and to store them in his aviary. His ignorance, as Socrates says, is the very thing not through want of knowledge, but actually in virtue of his knowledge. Because he has so many of these pigeons in his aviary, he has this confidence, perhaps overconfidence, that he knows, and he's liable to make mistakes, to make false judgments. He judges that this is actually something else, and that the other thing is it. Again, this false judgment. Now surely this is utterly unreasonable. It means that the soul, when knowledge becomes present to it, knows nothing, and is wholly ignorant. The prime integrator, the soul. According to this argument, there is no reason why the accession of ignorance should not make one know something, or of blindness make one see something. If knowledge is ever going to make a man ignorant. Now why is this? Perhaps it is because of the belief of man, of his fundamental faith, and that at that level, this is where the mistake can lie. Because how else? In the absence of truth, can one decide the truthfulness of his judgments? It could just as easily be blindness, as Socrates says, making one see. This knowledge making of a man, making of his ignorance. Theaetetus says, well, perhaps, Socrates, it wasn't a happy thought to make the birds only pieces of knowledge. Perhaps we ought to have supposed that there are pieces of ignorance also flying about in the soul along with them. And what happens is that the hunter sometimes catches a piece of knowledge and sometimes a piece of ignorance concerning the same thing. And the ignorance makes him judge falsely, while the knowledge makes him judge truly. I can hardly refrain from expressing my admiration of you, Theaetetus. But do think again about that. Let us suppose it is as you say, then you maintain the man who catches a piece of ignorance will judge falsely. Is that it? Yes. But presumably he will not think he is judging falsely. No, of course he won't. He will think he is judging what is true, and his attitude towards the things about which he is in error will be as if he knew them. Of course. He will think he has hunted down and has a piece of knowledge, and not a piece of ignorance. Yes, that's clear. So, after going a long way round, we are back at our original difficulty. Our friend, the expert in refutation, will laugh. My very good people, he will say, do you mean that a man who knows both knowledge and ignorance is thinking that one of them which he knows is the other which he knows? Or is it that he knows neither, and judges the one he doesn't know to be the other which he doesn't know? Or is it that he knows one and not the other, and judges that the one he knows is the one he doesn't know? Or does he think that the one he doesn't know is the one he does? Or are you going to start all over again and tell me that there's another set of pieces of knowledge concerning pieces of knowledge and ignorance, which a man may possess, shut up in some other ridiculous aviaries or waxen devices, which he knows so long as he possesses them, though he may not have them ready at hand in his soul, and in this way end up forced to come running round to the same place over and over again, and never get any further. What are we going to say to that, Theaetetus? Oh, dear me, Socrates, I don't know what one ought to say. Then don't you think, my boy, that the argument is perhaps dealing out a little proper chastisement, and showing us that we were wrong to leave the question about knowledge and proceed to inquire into false judgment first? While as a matter of fact it's impossible to know this until we have an adequate grasp of what knowledge is. Well, at the moment, Socrates, I feel bound to believe you. Then go back to the beginning. What are we going to say knowledge is? We are not, I suppose, going to give up yet? Certainly not, unless you give up yourself. Tell me, then, how could we define it with the least risk of contradicting ourselves? In the way we were attempting to before, Socrates, I can't think of any other. In what way do you mean? By saying that knowledge is true judgment. Judging truly is at least something free of mistakes, I take it, and everything that results from it is admirable and good. Well, Theaetetus, as the man who was leading the way across the river said, it will show you. If we go on and track this down, perhaps we may stumble on what we were looking for. If we stay where we are, nothing will come clear. You're right. Let's go on and consider it. Well, this won't take long to consider. Anyway, there is a whole art indicating to you that knowledge is not what you say. How's that? What art do you mean? The art of the greatest representatives of wisdom, the men called orators and lawyers. These men, I take it, use their art to produce conviction not by teaching people, but by making them judge whatever they themselves choose. Or do you think there are any teachers so clever that within the short time allowed by the clock they can teach adequately to people who were not eyewitnesses the truth of what happened to people who have been robbed or assaulted? No, I don't think that they possibly could, but they might be able to persuade them. And Socrates says, and by persuading them, you mean causing them to judge, don't you? Of course. Then suppose a jury has been justly persuaded of some matter which only an eyewitness could know, and which cannot otherwise be known. Suppose they come to their decision upon hearsay, forming a true judgment, then they have decided the case without knowledge. But granted, they did their job well, being correctly persuaded? Yes, certainly. Now I have to wonder what Socrates means by, then they have decided the case without knowledge. Because I can imagine two cases here, and we also have to keep in mind what Theaetetus said. He says, their primary focus here of this conversation, the thing that they return to, is that knowledge is true judgment. Judging truly is at least something free of mistakes. Now, even if this account of the eyewitness is hearsay, but they have formed a true judgment, would we say that this judgment was formed without knowledge? I think we would say, if it is true, they have decided the case on knowledge, but based on knowledge that was upon a relatively weak foundation, something for which judgment has little security in. Now, if it was false, of course we did not know, but we believed we knew, so it would be false judgment. Now it seems that Socrates considers the removal, this hearsay, this step removal, the witness says something that they heard somebody else say. That would be hearsay. It's a step removed from the actual event in question. Even if the witness was a witness of the event that happened, we would still be witnessing it through the witness's lens, which could still be true or false, but it would still more appropriately approach the focus of our attention, or that target. So I can understand what he means by saying that we don't know it in a certain sense, because it's so far away from the target. And if we pull the arrow back in the bow and we release that arrow, what we are aiming for is something that is not concrete. It's almost not necessarily a flip of a coin, but we are taking things to be known that really are not for certain. But then there again lies the question, well, what is for certain? They couldn't have done that if true judgment is the same thing as knowledge. In that case, the best jurymen in the world couldn't form a correct judgment without knowledge. So it seems they must be different things, says Socrates. So now we have judgment and knowledge are two different things. Or true judgment and knowledge, I should say, are two different things. Theaetetus responds, he said, "Oh yes, Socrates, that's just what I once heard a man say. I had forgotten it, but now it's coming back to me. He said that it is true judgment with an account, that is knowledge. True judgment without an account falls outside of knowledge. And he said that the things of which there is no account are not knowledgeable. Yes, he actually called them that. While those which have an account are knowledgeable. So what does it mean for something to have an account?" Now there is a footnote here. It says account translates logos, which can also mean statement, argument, speech, and discourse. Now what I'm getting from this is that a judgment is a decision. Now the decision can be true, but the decision can be made outside of the boundaries of knowledge. That is to say, we can judge correctly a coin toss, heads or tails. But we don't really know if it's going to be heads or tails. We just make the judgment. Now what Theaetetus is saying here, the man that he was talking to, says that a judgment with perhaps a statement, an argument, this logos, this account, this transaction, this record of something, if it is attached, if the judgment is attached to that, then it is knowledge. Perhaps, then, we could say that we have false judgment, but certainly we would have false knowledge. But then we would get into all sorts of strange assertions again. Socrates says, "Very good indeed. Now tell me, how did he distinguish these knowables and unknowables? I want to see if you and I have heard the same version." Theaetetus says, "I don't know if I can find that out, but I think I could follow if someone explained it." Listen then to a dream in return for a dream. In my dream, too, I thought I was listening to people saying that the primary elements, as it were, of which we and everything else are composed, have no account. Each of them, in itself, can only be named. It is not possible to say anything else of it. Either that it is, or it is not. That would mean that we were adding being or not being to it, whereas we must not attach anything if we are to speak of that thing itself alone. Indeed, we ought not to apply to it even such words as itself, or that, each, alone, or this, or any other of the many words of this kind. For these go the round, and are applied to all things alike, being other than the things to which they are added, whereas if it were possible to express the element itself, and it had its own proprietary account, it would have to be expressed without any other thing. As it is, however, it is impossible that any of the primaries should be expressed in an account. It can only be named, for a name is all that it has. But with the things composed of these, it is another matter. Here, just in the same way as the elements themselves are woven together, so their names may be woven together and become an account of something, an account being essentially a complex of names. Thus the elements are unaccountable and unknowable, but they are perceivable, whereas the complexes are both knowable and expressible, and can be the objects of true judgment. Now when a man gets a true judgment about something, without an account, his soul is in a state of truth as regards that thing, but he does not know it, for someone cannot give and take an account of a thing, is ignorant about it. But when he has also got an account of it, he is capable of all of this, and is made perfect in knowledge. Was the dream you heard the same as this, or a different one? Now Theaetetus says, no, it was the same in every respect. Okay, so now let's return to that statement by Socrates, and let's break it down bit by bit, because there's a lot of information there. So I think it's important, again, to bring up the word account. And remember what Theaetetus said, that it is true judgment with an account that is knowledge. True judgment without an account falls outside of knowledge. The things of which there is no account are not knowable, while those which have an account are knowable. So regardless of whether or not we agree with the statement, in order to understand it, we have to understand what this account is. And previously I said that in the footnotes it says that account translates as logos, which can also mean statement, argument, speech, and discourse. Now there's another definition for logos, which has to do with the divine order of things, the divine reason. But I think all of these things are pointing towards something, a judgment that is to be true if it's not to be just pure guesswork. And it is to have some directionality to it, rather than just guessing on a coin toss. If you attach it to an account, which again has a reasonable component to it, it has argumentation, discourse, or in other words, a process by which we determine, through reason, we use evidence to support a claim that something is in fact true, and then we make a judgment in conjunction with that account. Now, of course, we should be bringing in the questions of what is a appropriate statement, what is an argument, and what is this discourse that is the methodology by which we reach something that is known, rather that allows us to make a true judgment. Now Socrates says he's concerned with the difference between the knowables and the unknowables, that is, the judgment that is based on some account, and the one that is not. Now he begins by stating his dream. And it's a rather interesting dream, listening to people say that the primary elements of which we and everything else are composed have no account. Now, what does that imply? Well, if we take the fundamental elements of who we are, our being, of what we are, and we remove any account, we remove any statement or process by which we can come to know these fundamental principles, then how is it possible that if these things are unknowable, that the things that then are built of these things are knowable, that have an account? For it would seem that to have an account of anything would be to understand some fundamental principle about something, to follow it to some conclusion down the line, and to follow those principles and those fundamental elements in the way in which they are ordered, so that we can see and we can understand the combined order, let's say, that it creates. He says, each of them in itself can only be named. It is not possible to say anything else of it, either that it is or that it is not. It's a strange thing to say that we are able to name something, but that we are unable to say that it is or that it is not. For to give a name to something is to identify it. To give it a boundary around which we consider something that is. Now perhaps in the realm of abstraction, at the limits of the ability to see farther down that line, at the more fundamental elements, in the absence of any way of perceiving, perhaps in this way maybe there's an absence of an account there. It's not clear. He says, that would mean that we were adding being or not being to it, whereas we must not attach anything if we are to speak of that thing itself alone. Indeed, we ought not to apply to it even such words as itself, or that, each, alone, or this, or any other of the many words of this kind, for these go the round and are applied to all things alike, being other than the things to which they are added. Whereas, if it were possible to express the element itself, and it had its own proprietary account, it would have to be expressed without any other thing. So here we see a further distinction. Perhaps the name is sufficiently broad that it does not include something so distinct as an identifier. I don't know how that's possible, but when he says itself, or that, each, alone, or this, those all seem to point to something that is particular and identifiable. And perhaps what is being said here is that although these words are identifiers, they are not a true account. They are a vague representation. It's not sufficient to provide one with, if needed, a true judgment about the fundamental elements. Again, as he says, of which we and everything else are composed. And I say that because of the expression, for these go the round, and are applied to all things alike, being other than the things to which they are added. Whereas if it were possible to express the element itself, and it had its own proprietary account, it would have to be expressed without any other thing. So what I get from that is, when something is in relation to some other thing, or at least is described in relation to some other thing, it necessarily dilutes the ability to perceive of the thing itself. Because words that are sufficiently broad, these identifiers that we pointed out before, are appropriate in their own context for identification. And it's not to say that relational language is not appropriate. Certainly it is. But keeping in mind, we're talking about true judgment. We're talking about judgment with an account. So we're talking about giving an account to something that seemingly has been identified but not given an account. Has not been given some logical way of understanding what it is. Again, whereas if it were possible to express the element itself, and it had its own proprietary account, it would have to be expressed without any other thing. Now, a proprietary account is something that is unique to the thing. It expresses ownership. As it is, however, it is impossible that any of the primaries should be expressed in an account. It can only be named, for a name is all that it has. And so I think that this would seem to confirm what we were saying thus far, that we are looking for something that is more specific to attach to the thing that we are claiming is. And the thing that we are naming, the thing that we are outlining, is not sufficient as an account to explain the thing. Socrates says that there needs to be something that is primary, that should be expressed in an account, that it is the quality of an account to have something that is primary to the thing that is named, that is more than just the name itself. But with the things composed of these, that is the primary expressions that are fundamental to an account, it is another matter. Here, just in the same way as the elements themselves are woven together, so their names may be woven together and become an account of something. An account being essentially a complex of names. Thus the elements are unaccountable and unknowable, but they are perceivable. So this is interesting. So this is a bit antagonistic to the point that I made earlier on in reading this paragraph, when I said that they are not perceivable because they are so fundamental that it is possible that they are given just a name because of the lack of information. Now granted, we did already discuss that perceiving is not knowing. Here we see an account that is made up of informalities, perhaps, things that are not sufficient to accurately describe the thing that is, something that is not an appropriate account. He says here, again, just in the same way as the elements themselves are woven together, so their names may be woven together to become an account of something, an account being essentially a complex of names. And this complex of names differs from the complex of elements. And it is the complex of elements that are necessary for an account of that thing, whereas the name is insufficient. The name has value in and of itself, but it is insufficient to give an account for the thing. Thus the elements are unaccountable and unknowable, because what we have given an account to is just the names and not the elements. But they are perceivable, whereas the complexes are both knowable and expressible, and can be the objects of true judgment. The fundamental elements are the things that are knowable and expressible. They are perceivable. So we find ourselves in an interesting predicament, by which if we give something a name without sufficient evidence, without sufficient understanding, observation, argumentation, then the thing itself truly is unknowable, but still identifiable and perceivable. However, the complex of elements are both knowable and expressible, and can be the objects of true judgment, as he says. Now, when a man gets a true judgment about something without an account, his soul is in a state of truth as regards to that thing. But he does not know it. Again, this is the flipping of the coin, the heads or tails. We pick something that may or may not be right. If we are right, it just happens to be right. It's not as though we understood something fundamental about the process of the coin flip that would lead to us picking heads or tails. There's a 50-50% chance. Similarly, there was a Senate hearing, not too long ago, maybe about 5 days ago or so, with the director, the head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and she was questioned about certain remarks that she had made during the pandemic. And her response to them, to the allegations of the falsehoods, was that at the time, due to the data and the evidence, it was true. And I thought such a bizarre and strange thing to say. Because if you are saying that the data and the information at the time was pointing in a particular direction, which made you think that something was true, but then later on, given perhaps more information, it was determined that the thing that you thought before was not true, it would also mean that the statement that you made back then was not true. But in the argument given by the CDC director, she claims that at the time, given the information, the decision, perhaps the judgment, was true, which of course is not true. It's an avoidance of the responsibility of truth, and a bizarre statement to make. So again, now when a man gets a true judgment about something without an account, or if he believes that, in the case of the CDC director, that there is an account based on this information, but the account is incorrectly attributed to the judgment, it would be a false judgment. His soul is in a state of truth as regards to that thing, not in the case of the CDC director. But he does not know it. For someone who cannot give and take an account of a thing is ignorant about that. But when he has also got an account of it, he is capable of all this, and is made perfect in knowledge. Was the dream you heard the same as this, or a different one? Theaetetus says no, it was the same in every respect. Do you like this then? And do you suggest that knowledge is true judgment with an account? Theaetetus says yes, certainly. Theaetetus, can it be that all in a moment? You and I have today laid hands upon something which many a wise man has searched for in the past, and has gone gray before he found it. Well, it does seem to me, anyway, Socrates, that what has just been said puts the matter very well. And it seems likely enough that the matter is really so, for what knowledge could there be apart from an account and correct judgment? But there is one of the things said which I don't like. And what's that? What looks like the subtlest point of all, that the elements are unknowable, and the complex is knowable. And won't that do? We must make sure, because, you see, we do have as hostages for this theory the original models that were used when all these statements were made. What models? Socrates says letters, the elements of language, and syllables. It must have been these, mustn't it, that the author of our theory had in view. It couldn't have been anything else. I guess there's a few interesting things there. I know we haven't read a lot so far, but just beginning with the point that Socrates has trouble with here. The elements are unknowable, and the complexes knowable. So what does that mean? So, well, it means that an element is something that is the primary foundation of something that is specific to its character or its nature. As in a house, let's say, the foundation would be the poured concrete on a level surface, a leveled piece of land. And then the support beams that hold up the necessary supports, or the necessary structure, the scaffolding of the house. In this way, these are the fundamental elements of the house, because without them you would not have the thing that is the house. These are the things that allow the house to be named, that allows it to be a thing. Now, when we think about the complex of the house, there are many different components to the house. And at a certain level, the house is not a house, but it could still contain particular fundamental elements. A house is something that includes its fundamental elements, but also elements that build upon one another to form a complex. That is something that is consisting of many different and connected parts. We wouldn't say that a base foundation, so some leveled piece of earth with concrete poured over it, is a house. But we wouldn't say that something without proper supports that hold up, like let's say a roof over the head of the person that enters into this building, is a house. There are certain tricks, I think, that we can play with language. A house has a certain conventionality to it, whereas it largely by convention excludes things like a tent on a piece of land. We can consider that a home if that's our primary resting place, but we probably wouldn't really consider that to be a house. A house is something that is particular, and we may refer to a house informally as perhaps like a condo or an apartment, but it still applies to the structure of the building, perhaps. But all of that funkiness and flexibility of language aside, if we're just going to strictly stick with something that is formal, that is a house that is unitary on a plot of land, I think that just to sum this up, there are the fundamental elements that make up the house, but the fundamental elements themselves are not a house, whereas the complex, the thing that is the house, requires those elements, and without them would not be a house. So now to return this to Socrates, this is a little bit different than the analogy that we were using, but at least we can understand complexes and we can understand elements and their interaction from that example. In this example, what he is concerned about is that the elements themselves are unknowable, and the complexes are the only thing that's knowable. So in our example of the house, it would be impossible to know what the fundamental elements that make that house are. All we know is that it is a house. And he says we must make sure, because, you see, we do have as hostages for this theory the original models that were used when all these statements were made. Now that there is interesting to say, because unlike before, we're not necessarily talking about Protagoras anymore, or of the Ionian school. So I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to. But then when he continues, when Theaetetus says, what models, he says letters. And so the original theory, or for this theory, the original models that were used when the statements were made, he's talking about the fundamental components of language. He's talking about sort of the layer beneath. So he says letters, the elements of language. So these are the letters to language are our foundation and supports to our house. And syllables, he says. Now there's a footnote here that says, in quotes, letters translates stoicheia, which can also mean elements, more generally, and is also translated sometimes as sometimes below. So syllables in Greek, syllabi, also translated below as complexes. So interesting. It must have been these, mustn't it, that the author of our theory had in view. It couldn't have been anything else. So that's another interesting thing to refer to the author of our theory. I think there can be a few different things that are referred to there. But what it's pointing to is interesting. I'm wondering if he's pointing to a logos. That is a divine order to things. Now he could be pointing to an ancient way of thinking. He can be referring to himself. But that aside, no, he mustn't have been thinking of letters and syllables. Let's take and examine them then, or rather let us examine ourselves, and ask ourselves whether we really learned our letters in this way or not. Now, to begin with, one can give an account of the syllables, but not of the letters. Is that it? Well, perhaps. It most certainly looks like that to me. At any rate, supposing you were to ask about the first syllable of Socrates. Tell me, Theaetetus, what is so, or S-O? That's the first syllable in Socrates. What would you answer to that? Theaetetus says that it's S and O. Socrates says, and there you have an account of the syllable? Theaetetus says, yes. Come along then, and let us have an account of S in the same way. So when Socrates says, and there you have an account of the syllable, after Theaetetus says that the first syllable in Socrates is the S and the O, of particular interest of my attention is, again, the word account. Because as we were talking about before, a judgment with an account is going to be the thing that, if there is anything true about something, it is going to be through that method. And through that method, if one reaches some truth, it is then knowable, because it is not. It is based in some reason. It has some intelligible pattern. It has something to follow. And so, when he says, and there you have an account of the syllable, it brings to mind what he had mentioned, what Socrates had mentioned before about the fundamental elements being unknowable. For here we have, seemingly, the next step from the fundamental element that we would consider to be the letter. Now, the account is given to the syllable because it has a place. It has grounding in some larger body, this body of the word of Socrates. The syllable is something. It has a purpose. And then when he says, come along then, and let us have the account of the S in the same way, before even reading into this, or reading further, I'd like to take a moment just to reflect on what the possibility of this could be, because remember we were talking about a fundamental element now. We're a step back from the complex, as it were, the complex of this syllable that then is integrated into the word, which is another complex. Each of these, as they become more and more complicated, I suppose, can be given an account. But what of the letters? What of the things that we are presuming so far cannot be given an account, and therefore are unknowable? What is this S? Well, I think at a fundamental level, the letters have their own uniqueness. They have their own pronunciation. They have the ability to be perceived and characterized. And I think insofar as they are recognizable and differentiated, I think it is possible to use them in such a way to combine them and to make things from them. That is why they are fundamental things. But what is the account of the fundamental? Is the account purely that they are fundamental things that differ from other fundamental things? What is the knowableness about the S? It has a written form and has a verbal form. Its verbal form is paired with a particular vocal pattern, a particular shape of the tongue and of the facial muscles. Perhaps the S is seen or heard in nature. Perhaps as the snake hisses, we hear the S. And through that symbol, through that experience and event, we can attribute a various number of things that we might symbolize the serpent to be. We need not get into that, but I could see a path in that direction. Now Theaetetus says, how can anyone give the letters of a letter? Now it's interesting here, when he is asked to give the account of the S, immediately he goes into finding something more fundamental. He's trying to break down even more. And in this way, this, what would you call it? Deduction. This reducibility of a thing into its components is what he is considering this account to be. S, he says, is just one of the voiceless letters, Socrates, a mere sound like a hissing of the tongue. B, again, has neither voice nor sound, and that's true of most letters. And so the statement that they themselves are unaccountable holds perfectly good. Even in the 7 clearest have only voice. No sort of account whatever can be given to them. Socrates says, so here, my friend, we have established a point about knowledge. We do appear to have done so. Socrates says, well then, we have shown that the syllable is knowable, but the letter is not. Is that all right? It seems the natural conclusion anyway, says Theaetetus. So let's go back to what Theaetetus says here. He says, since the letter S cannot be broken down any further, it cannot be reduced any further, S is just one of the voiceless letters. a mere sound like the hissing of a tongue. So aside from it not being able to be reduced, it is a voiceless letter. It's an interesting expression because it literally is a voiceless letter because it really doesn't involve the vocal cords. It's more of a, it's the air as it passes the tongue in a particular manner. And in that way it's voiceless. But it's also voiceless in the manner that it has no meaning. It's not a word that is attached to anything. He says B has neither voice nor sound. And that's true of most letters. So the statement that they themselves are unaccountable holds perfectly good. So having neither voice nor sound, again, it's the attachment of some purpose, some meaning. Again, this account. The account could be some way to get to. It could be some establishment of. It could be some reason why. But as we've tried to discuss, the purpose of the S, it would seem here that between Theaetetus and Socrates there is no reason, there's no account that they can give. Look here, says Socrates, what do we mean by the syllable? The two letters, or if there are more, all the letters? Or do we mean some single form produced by their combination? Theaetetus says, I think we mean all the letters. Then take the case of the two letters, S and O. These two are the first syllable of my name. If a man knows the syllable, he must know both the letters? Theaetetus says, of course. So he knows S and O. Yes. But can it be that he is ignorant of each one, and knows the two of them without knowing either? Theaetetus says that would be a strange and unaccountable thing, Socrates. Now this is a familiar place. I feel like we've been here before. And yet, says Socrates, supposing it is necessary to know each in order to know both, then it is absolutely necessary that anyone who is ever to know a syllable must first get to know the letters. And in admitting this, we shall find that our beautiful theory has taken to its heels and got clean away from us. And very suddenly too, says Theaetetus. Yes, we are not keeping a proper watch on it. Perhaps we ought not to have supposed the syllable to be the letters. Perhaps we ought to have made it some single form produced out of them, having its own single nature, something different from the letters. Yes, certainly, that might be more like it. We must look into the matter. We have no right to betray a great and imposing theory in this faint-hearted manner. Certainly not. Now, before we move forward, there's a footnote that had to do with Theaetetus' original comment. It says, the 7 vowels of ancient Greek, as contrasted with 2 classes of consonant, mutes like B, which cannot be pronounced without a vowel, and semivowels like S, which can. It's just a clarification point there. Socrates says, then let it be as we were now suggesting. Let the complex be a single form resulting from the combination of the several elements when they fit together, and let this hold both of language and of things in general. Yes, certainly. Then it must have no parts. And Theaetetus says, why is that now? Because when a thing has parts, the whole is necessarily all the parts. Or do you mean by the whole also a single form arising out of the parts, yet different from all of the parts? Theaetetus says, I do. Now do you call sum and whole the same thing or different things? Now there's a footnote. The word translated sum, pan, and the word translated all, panta, and the phrase all the parts are singular and plural forms of the same Greek word. So again, Socrates says, now do you call the sum and the whole the same thing or different things? Theaetetus says, I don't feel at all certain, but as you keep telling me to answer up with a good will, I will take the risk and say that they are different. Your good will, Theaetetus, is all that it should be. Now we must see if your answer is too. We must, of course. As the argument stands at present, the whole will be different from the sum. Theaetetus says yes. Well now, is there any difference between all of the things and the sum? For instance, when we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or twice 3, or 3 times 2, and 4 and 2, 3 and 2 and 1, are we speaking of the same thing in all these cases or different things? Theaetetus says the same thing. That is 6? Precisely. Then with each expression we have not spoken of all the 6? Yes. And when we speak of them all, aren't we speaking of a sum? We must be. That is 6? Precisely. Then in all things made up of number, at any rate, by the sum and all of them we mean the same thing. So it seems. Now let us talk about them in this way. The number of an acre is the same thing as an acre, isn't it? Theaetetus says yes. Similarly with a mile. Yes. And the number of an army is the same as the army. And so always with things of this sort, their total number is the sum that each of them is. Yes. But is the number of each anything other than its parts? Theaetetus says no. Now things which have parts consist of parts. That seems true. And it is agreed that all the parts are the sum, seeing that the total number is to be the sum. That is so. Then the whole does not consist of parts, for if it did, it would be all the parts, and so would be a sum. It looks as if it doesn't. But can a part as such be a part of anything but the whole? Theaetetus says yes, of the sum. You are putting up a good fight anyway, Theaetetus. But this sum now, isn't it just when there is nothing lacking that it is a sum? Yes, necessarily. And won't this very same thing, that from which nothing anywhere is lacking, be a whole? Well, a thing from which something is absent is neither a whole nor a sum. The same consequence having followed from the same condition in both cases at once? Well, it doesn't seem to me now that there can be any difference between whole and sum. Very well. Now were we not saying that in the case of a thing that has parts, both the whole and the sum will be all the parts? Yes, certainly. Now come back to the thing I was trying to get at just now. Supposing the syllable is not just its letters, doesn't it follow that it cannot contain the letters as parts of itself? Alternatively, if it is the same as the letters, it must be equally knowable with them. Theaetetus says that is so. Well, wasn't it just in order to avoid this result that we supposed it different from the letters? Yes. Well then, if the letters are not parts of the syllable, can you tell me of any other things not its letters, which are. No, indeed. If I were to admit that it had component parts, Socrates, it would be ridiculous, of course, to set aside the letters and look for other components. Then, Theaetetus, according to our present argument, a syllable is an absolutely single form, indivisible into parts. It looks like it. Now, my friend, a little while ago, if you remember, we were inclined to accept a certain position which we thought put the matter very well. I mean the statement that no account can be given of the primaries of which other things are constituted, because each of them is in itself incomposite, and that it would be incorrect to apply even the term being to it when we spoke of it, or the term this, because these terms signify different and alien things, and that this is the reason why a primary is an unaccountable and unknowable thing. Do you remember? So what are we talking about here? Let's try and synthesize what we have so far. There are a few points of contention that I found difficult with this present course. But, just to begin with my general understanding of what we've read so far, it seems as though we are engaged in a struggle to determine exactly what the relationship is between the parts of a thing and the thing itself, and in what ways they differ. So we began by talking about the complex, the whole, the thing that is made up of parts. Socrates says, then let it be as we are now suggesting. Let the complex be a single form resulting from the combination of the several elements when they fit together. And let this hold both of language and of things in general. Then Socrates makes the assertion then it should have no parts. And this is seemingly counterintuitive. And Socrates says, because when a thing has parts, the whole is necessarily all the parts. And he says, or do you mean by the whole also a single form arising out of the parts, yet different from all of the parts? And so this distinction is interesting because, when we think of the building materials, the fundamentals of a house, they are quite different from what we conceptualize a house, or even farther, a home is to be. When we come back to our home, assuming that perhaps we are not engaged in the trade professions, because this may be at the top of the mind all of the time, that is, the thinking about materials, but when we have returned home, what we are interested in is not so much the drywall and the wood and the concrete and the flooring. We're concerned with, in some sense, rest. When we come home after work, we are concerned with building relationships. We are concerned with feeling at ease. We are concerned with understanding the place that we are at is for belonging. The whole of the parts has become something that is different. It means something that is more substantial than its parts. Now, it doesn't mean that it always has to be this way, but I think it's a good example that allows us to see how the whole, or the composite, can differ from its parts in terms of its value to us. Now, they ultimately come to the conclusion that it doesn't seem that there is any difference between the whole and the sum. They went into this dialogue about the parts being added to form a total, and this is a sum of the parts, and they decided that this is equivalent to the whole. And Socrates says, were we not saying that in the case of things that has parts, both the whole and the sum will be all the parts? He says, come back to the thing I was trying to get at just now. Supposing the syllable is not just its letters, doesn't it follow that it cannot contain the letters as parts of itself? Alternatively, if it is the same as the letters, it must be equally knowable with them. Now this statement, I think, is a difficult one to follow. It's difficult to follow because I understand that the syllable is a thing in and of itself. I also understand that it is made up of letters. It would not exist if there was not the S and the O. This is the example that we're using, that Socrates used earlier, the first syllable of his name. Supposing the syllable is not just its letters. And I can get on board with that, because certainly the syllable is not just its letters, because the S and the O itself does not have the same meaning, let's say, as the syllable SO. And if it were indeed the case, as Socrates says, that doesn't it follow that it cannot contain the letters as parts of itself? That would be true if the first syllable was, as we get to, is unbreakable. We cannot deduce it into its S and O elements. He says, alternatively, if it is the same as the letters, it must be equally knowable with them. And so what does he mean by that? If it is the same as the letters, that being the whole, or the first syllable of the name Socrates, it, being the syllable, must be equally knowable with them, that is, the letters. Now what does it mean for it to mean equally knowable? And this has to do with the conversation that they were having earlier about the bedrock of elements, let's say, the letters. And it is difficult to say that they are, or that one can give a true account to the letters. And we have to remember that giving an account to something is a part of making a true judgment. That when judgment is attached to this account, it provides it with the mechanism, the reasoning that one follows to make a judgment. It gives it an orientation and a direction. Now, for some reason here, they have established that the letters have no account, but the syllable does have an account. Now, I understand that I'm repeating previously covered ground here, but I think it's good to go over, repave the surface. When they are repaving the roads, they don't just go over it once, they go over it many times to make sure it's flat and solid, and then they go over it with the next layer and do the same thing. So again, the syllable has an account because we can understand that it is of the S and the O, but when we try to do this process and give an account to those elements, the S and the O, we have the reasoning that Theaetetus says, how can anyone give the letters of a letter? Or how can one deduce any further? S is just one of the voiceless letters, Socrates, a mere sound like a hissing of the tongue. B, again, has neither voice nor sound, and that's true of most letters. So the statement that they themselves are undecountable holds perfectly good. Even the 7 clearest have only voice, and no sort of account whatever can be given to them. And I find it a bit difficult to understand exactly what that means. Now, I understand where they're going. I understand that they want to break down the S to give an account so that they can make a judgment about what the S is. But certainly it would seem that the S is, or let's say any letter that is able to be verbalized, has more fundamental components to it that involves that verbalized aspect. Now, it could be the case that there is a difficulty understanding at the micro scale what it would mean for a person to produce sound. Surely they are aware of that mechanism and they understand it. But perhaps it's possible that they find themselves at the end of a particular road that is of the characterization of language by certain things. Now, letters being the fundamental elements. Once we hit the element, where do we go from there? What is the letter of a letter? What are the building blocks of the fundamental building blocks? And I think it is possible to go farther, because just like a brick is a fundamental building block, or a concrete or rebar is a fundamental building block, we can go farther into its molecular structure, or the makeup of the mix that is the concrete. But therein lies another interesting dilemma, because we can continue to go in that direction, seemingly indefinitely, until we reach the smallest piece that is unable to be deduced any further. So it doesn't really matter if we agree that the letter is the fundamental stopping point. At some point there will be a point at which we have to stop. At least we conceive of that being true. That again, at the most fundamental place, we can no longer determine exactly what builds that thing. And so when a thing at that level is, it just is. It is not from something else. But at the same time, which is fascinating, is that when we imagine a whole, or something that is made up of parts, we distinguish this whole as being separate from its parts, as having some characteristic or identity that is assumed because of the interaction of the elements. And while we can break it down further into its elements and to give it an account in that way, just like the fundamental element that can't be broken down any further, the whole has and shares the distinction of what is, that it is something independent of something else. And so it's possible that the giving of an account has to be more than just what it is made of, or what it is from. All of this is in light of the statements that are made, such as, well, the letters can't be known, but the syllable can. And again, the syllable can be known because it can be given an account by its makeup, by its parts, and by the characteristic of the whole, that it is. At this point, I find it a rather strange way to view it. So the picture does begin to form clearly, and I'll have to apologize at this moment because I'm going to be repeating myself a lot here, but it's going to be important to coalesce. And coalescing involves a lot of turning and revolutions, but the spiral does begin to decrease in its diameter towards the top, as it begins to centralize into a point. So this is the general flow that I'm going to follow. So we're going back a few pages here. But we are talking again about this S and the O. Socrates asked the question, but can it be that he is ignorant of each one, and knows the two of them without knowing the other? Knowing the two of them, meaning knowing the syllable. Now, why is this important? Well, because to know the syllable is to give an account to the syllable. And by the thought process so far, this account has to do with understanding its fundamental components. And so if we were to use the house analogy, is it possible to know the house or the home without knowing its fundamental parts? And the answer is yes, I think so. You wouldn't know how to build a house. And so perhaps that therein lies part of the distinction. That knowing the elements allows us to know some things but not others. And also, knowing the whole that is made up of those parts allows us to know the thing about the whole that is, but not necessarily about its parts. There's an affordance there. Now, the more complete knowledge is to understand the whole as separate from its parts, but also to understand the parts in relation to the whole. And in so doing, we can give a certain type of account to the house and to the home. But understanding the home, we can give an account of its own characteristics to itself. Now, I may walk back on that statement, but for now that seems to follow reason. That seems to make sense to me. Socrates says, and yet, supposing it is necessary to know each in order to know both, then it is absolutely necessary that anyone who is ever to know a syllable must first get to know the letters. And in admitting this, we shall find that our beautiful theory has taken to its heels and got clean away from us. We are not keeping a proper watch on it. Perhaps we ought not to have supposed that the syllable to be the letters. Perhaps we ought to have made it some single form produced out of them, having its own single nature, something different from its letters. And so I think here we can see this tension between the two things. Well, how do we understand something? Is it of its letters, or do we have to think of it as its whole? And this is where we return back to the statement by Socrates, let the complex be a single form resulting from the combination of the several elements when they fit together, and let this hold both of language and of things in general. Then the wild statement, then it must have no parts. This hamster wheel. Why does it have no parts? Well, because the whole is a thing in and of itself. The whole is necessarily all of its parts. Then the confirming or distinctive question, do you mean by the whole also a thing that arises out of the parts? Okay. A little bit more specific there. Then we go into the categorization of the sum and the relationship of the sum to the whole. And again, eventually we come back to the point of Theaetetus saying, it doesn't seem to me now that there can be any difference between whole and sum. Socrates, now were we not saying that in the case of a thing that has parts, both the whole and the sum will be all the parts? Supposing the syllable is not just its letters, doesn't it follow that it cannot contain the letters as parts of itself? Alternatively, if it is the same as the letters, it must be equally knowable with them. And so here we're back. But now we have a little bit more ammunition to understand what they're talking about. It's this whole versus part dynamic. It is how do we understand something? How do we give a true account to something? Can it only exist within its parts in understanding its fundamental nature? Or does it only exist in the relationship between the parts that forms something entirely different, that is the whole? Or can it be both? According to our present argument, a syllable is an absolutely single form, indivisible into parts. And this is another frustrating point because, well, of course it's divisible into parts. It's divisible into its letters. But the letters, as they say, are unknowable because they are the fundamental bedrock. And they say it's unknowable because of the way that they characterize knowing. That is, that it has to have an account, and the definition, it seems, that they are giving to their account has to do with the breaking down of something into its fundamental elements. Because now we know where it comes from. It comes from these two things. But again, herein lies the problem. We have this tricky situation about the nature of the whole being something in and of itself. And if that is indeed true, well, certainly it must be that the whole, just as the most fundamental of elements, has its own identity. But what does that mean for giving something an account? How can we possibly make a true judgment if we can't make an account? Well then, again, the account has to be something that is broadened in its definition. So that it can include both the most fundamental of elements so that we can actually identify and recognize it and say that it is knowable, while we can also say that the whole is knowable, apart from just breaking it down into its parts, which is indeed a part of knowing it, but it cannot be the entirety of knowing it. A little while ago, says Socrates, we were inclined to accept a certain proposition which we thought put the matter very well. I mean the statement that no account can be given of the primaries of which other things are constituted, because each of them is in itself incomposite, and that it would be incorrect to apply even the term being to it when we spoke of it, or the term this, because these terms signify different and alien things. And that is the reason why a primary is an unaccountable and unknowable thing. Do you remember? And so this is a reiteration of what we were just talking about. Well, we just went back to their conversation and picked out those passages. Socrates is reiterating here the statement that no account can be given of the primaries of which other things are constituted, because each of them is in itself incomposite. Okay, this is what we're talking about. The fundamental bedrock, the irreducible element. And that it would be incorrect to apply even the term being to it when we spoke of it, or the term this, because these terms signify different and alien things, and that this is the reason why a primary is an unaccountable and unknowable thing. So this gets into my argument about, well, this is the entire thing about the dialogue. What is knowable then, if this is the case? Socrates says, and is that the reason also why it is single in form and indivisible into parts? Or is there some other reason for that? I can see no other myself. No, there really doesn't seem to be any other. And hasn't the complex now fallen into the same class as the primary, seeing it has no parts, and it is a single form? So interesting. Now this is a path that we've walked from the outset. Now we're to the whole, recognizing that it is a thing in and of itself. Having its own identity, it can't be broken down, and yet it is made up of its parts. That's how it's given an account. So we have two things that we're wrestling with here. Theaetetus says, yes, it certainly is. Well now, if the complex is both many elements and a whole, with them as its parts, then both complexes and elements are equally capable of being known and expressed, since all the parts turn out to be the same thing as the whole. Okay, here we go. Now we're on a reasonable path. Theaetetus says, yes, surely. But if, on the other hand, the complex is single and without parts, then complexes and elements are equally unaccountable and unknowable, both of them for the same reason. Now we're progressing down this path. Certainly still some road to go. Because when Socrates says, well, if the complex is both many elements and a whole, with them as its parts, then both complexes and elements are equally capable of being known and expressed, since all the parts turned out to be the same thing as the whole. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it. However, if the parts are the same as the whole, if the wood and the concrete and the rebar is the same thing as the home, then I think we would have difficulty understanding and separating the elements themselves. It does, I think, however, provide us with the relationship that I think is undoubtable between the parts and the whole, that there is some connection there. On the other hand, the complex is single and without parts. Then complexes and elements are equally unaccountable and unknowable. So then again, this is also reasonable, but it makes me question what is accountable. Because there are ways for which we can say things about them to characterize them and to make them intelligible to us. in a certain sense, make them knowable, to catch that pigeon and put it into its aviary. Socrates says then, if anyone tries to tell us that the complex can be known and expressed, while the contrary is true of the element, we had better not listen to him. No, we'd better not, if we go along with the argument, says Theaetetus. And more than this, wouldn't you more easily believe somebody who made the contrary statement, because of what you know of your own experience in learning to read and write? What kind of thing do you mean? I mean, that when you were learning, you spent your time just precisely in trying to distinguish, both by eye and ear, each individual letter in itself, so that you might not be bewildered by their different positions in written and spoken words. Theaetetus says that's perfectly true. And at the music teacher's, wasn't the finished pupil the one who would follow each note and tell to which string it belonged, and notes being generally admitted to be the elements of music? Yes, that's just what it amounted to. Then if the proper procedure is to take such elements and complexes as we ourselves have experience of, and make an inference from them to the rest, we shall say that the elements are much more clearly known, and the knowledge of them is more decisive for the mastery of any branch of study than knowledge of the complex. And if anyone maintains that the complex is by nature knowable, and the elements unknowable, we shall regard this as tomfoolery, whether it is intended to be or not. And Theaetetus says, oh, quite. So what now? Now, this is something that, of course, according to our own experiences, even as Socrates says here, as a student is learning, they must attend to the fundamental elements of something in order for them to grasp what is to become the more complex objects of their attention. And so Socrates says, when you were beginning to learn, you spent your time just precisely in trying to distinguish, both by eye and ear, each individual letter in itself, so that you might not be bewildered by their different positions in written and spoken words. And so it is the grasping, the holding of the fundamental elements, which are the birds in this aviary, which can be the birds in this aviary. When we go hunting for them, we must have a solid understanding of their character, that is, their shape, their form, and the same is in music as with their notes, the sound and the position on the instrument. He says, if the proper procedure is to take such elements and complexes as we ourselves have experience of, and make an inference from them to the rest, we shall say that the elements are much more clearly known, and knowledge of them is more decisive for the mastery of any branch of study than knowledge of the complex. And here the elements become the tools. They're the tools by which we understand complexes. If anyone maintains that the complex is by nature knowable and the element unknowable, we shall regard this as tomfoolery, whether it is intended to be or not. So now we have come to an understanding that the elements are knowable. If we are to agree that the complex is also knowable. Socrates says, I think that might be proved in other ways too, but we mustn't let them distract us from the problem before us. We wanted to see what can be meant by the proposition that it is in the addition of an account to a true judgment that knowledge is perfected. Well, yes, we must certainly try to see that, says Theaetetus. Come then, what are we intended to understand by an account? I think it must be one of three meanings. So finally, we have taken into account, pun intended, the definition of our account, because our prior definition of account did not suffice. Theaetetus says, what are they? The first would be making one's thought apparent vocally by means of words and verbal expressions. When a man impresses an image of his judgment upon the stream of speech, like reflections upon water or in a mirror, don't you think this kind of thing is an account? Certainly a beautiful way to put that. It seems like if we are to imagine account as a whole that has parts to it, and this is the first of the parts that we've identified, this is the first element of an account, it seems fundamental, certainly, to begin with verbal expression. To give one's thought words. And I'll read it again just because it's again a beautiful way to put it. When a man impresses an image of his judgment upon the stream of speech, like reflections upon water or in a mirror, don't you think this kind of thing is an account? So what is it reflecting? Well, the mirror is reflecting his thoughts, and the reflection is through his verbal expression and through his words. Or we could say that the judgment is our stamp. Again, it's the thing that we are going to impress into this stream that includes a bunch of words and letters, let's say, that are just flowing about as in a stream. We take the stream, as if it were a body of ink. We dip our stamp into it, our judgment, and then we place it upon some surface to be reflected. Now it is not just basic judgment. It includes words, and it includes verbal expression. So in this way, it becomes an account. It is more than just determining if the result of a coin toss will be heads or tails. Theaetetus says, yes, I do. At least, a man who does this is said to be giving an account. But isn't that a thing that everyone is able to do more or less readily? I mean, indicate what he thinks about a thing, if he is not deaf or dumb to begin with. And that being so, anyone at all who makes a correct judgment will turn out to have it together with an account. Correct judgment, without knowledge, will no longer be found anywhere. We mustn't be too ready to condemn the author of the definition of knowledge now before us for talking nonsense. Perhaps he didn't mean this. Perhaps he meant being able, when questioned about what a thing is, to give an answer by reference to its elements. So again, this is our more traditional understanding of account from our argument. It is to refer to the elements. And by giving an account of its elements, we will be able to more appropriately understand or know the complex. Socrates, as for example, what Hesiod is doing when he says, 100 are the timbers of a wagon. Now, I couldn't say what they are, and I don't suppose you could either. If you and I were asked what a wagon is, we should be satisfied if we could answer wheels, axle, body, rails, yoke. Yes, surely, says Theaetetus. But he might think us ridiculous, just as he would if we were asked what your name is, and reply by giving the syllables. In that case, he would think us ridiculous because although we might be correct in our judgment and our expression of it, we should be fancying ourselves as scholars, thinking we knew and were expressing a scholar's account of Theaetetus' name, whereas in fact no one gives an account of a thing with knowledge till, in addition to his true judgment, he goes right through the thing element by element, as I think we have said before. So on the surface, it's simple to understand what is being said here. I think we can readily understand why it would be ridiculous for if somebody were to ask us what our name is, we began to break that name down into syllables. This is something that we might find in a Monty Python skit, some English humor. He says, although we might be correct in our judgment and our expression of it, we should be fancying ourselves as scholars, thinking we knew and were expressing a scholar's account of Theaetetus' name. Now this next sentence I think is an important one. He says, whereas, in fact, no one gives an account of a thing with knowledge till, in addition to his true judgment, he goes right through the thing element by element, as I think we have said before. So what does he mean here? What does he mean when he says, no one gives an account of a thing with knowledge till, in addition to his true judgment, he goes right through the thing element by element? So in addition to his true judgment, I think is an important thing here. So how would that apply to this case? If we are to say that we say whatever our name is, my name is Theaetetus. This is my true judgment. But he says, no one gives an account of a thing with knowledge until, or in addition, till and in addition to his true judgment. He goes right through the thing element by element. Now an example of this, the example of the wagon, says Socrates. He would say that we have indeed correct judgment, but it is the man who can explore its being by going through those 100 items, who has made the addition which adds an account to his true judgment. It is this man who has passed from mere judgment to expert knowledge of the being of a wagon. And he has done so in virtue of having gone over the whole by means of the elements. So, what I'm getting from this is there are layers. We can make a true judgment, and we can provide some perhaps superficial reason. In the case of the wagon, their answer was wheels, axle, body, rails, yoke. Each of those has a definition, but we have to remember that the fundamental elements are the 100 timbers. They were correct in their judgment by saying these things. Then he says, but it is the man who can explore its being by going through those 100 items, who has made the addition, which adds an account to his true judgment. So in this version of the account, we are sort of back to where we began in a certain respect. That the account is, and true knowing is, when it is attached to a true judgment, the account for its fundamental parts. A complex, and the account for the complex through its fundamental elements. It is this man who has passed from mere judgment to expert knowledge of the being of a wagon, and he has done so in virtue of having gone over the whole by means of its elements. Theaetetus says, and doesn't that seem sound to you, Socrates? He says, well, tell me if it seems sound to you, my friend. Tell me if you are prepared to accept the view that an account is a matter of going through a thing element by element, while going through it by syllables or larger divisions falls short of being an account. Then we shall be able to discuss it. So here it sheds a little bit more light on the prior paragraph that we had read, that I didn't quite make that connection. That the syllables are not the fundamental elements. I think I got distracted by the conversation in which they said, well, the letters are not knowable and all this sort of thing. But that was a prior discussion. We are beyond that. We have since determined that the elements certainly are knowable, and they are, in a sense, a prerequisite to understanding the complex. In one version of our account, Theaetetus says, I'm certainly prepared to accept that. Socrates says, and do you at the same time think that a man has knowledge of anything when he believes the same thing now to be a part of one thing and now part of something else? Or when he judges that now one thing and now something different belongs to one and the same object? So what does that mean exactly? He says, and do you at the same time think that a man has knowledge of anything when he believes the same thing now to be a part of one thing and now a part of something else? It's difficult to find an example. He believes the same thing now to be part of one thing and now part of something else. It's certainly possible to have an element to be an element that makes up two different complexes. Now you'd have to have two separate elements, but of the same nature, to produce two different complexes. At the same time, think that a man has knowledge of anything when he believes the same thing now to be a part of one thing and now a part of something else. Or when he judges that now one thing and now something different belongs to one and the same object. Theaetetus says, no, indeed I don't. Then have you forgotten that at first, when you were learning to read and write, that is just what you and the other boys used to do? You mean we used to think that sometimes one letter and sometimes another belonged to the same syllable? And used to put the same letter sometimes into its proper syllable and sometimes into another? Socrates says, yes, that is what I mean. Well, I certainly haven't forgotten that I don't think people at that stage can be said to have knowledge yet. Well, suppose now that someone who is at this sort of stage is writing the name Theaetetus. He thinks he ought to write the, or The. That is the beginning of Theaetetus' name, and does so. When suppose another time he is trying to write Theodorus, and this time he thinks he should write Te, and proceeds to do so, are we going to say that he knows the first syllable of your names? Theaetetus says no. We've admitted that anyone who is at that stage has not yet knowledge. And is there anything to prevent the same person being in that situation as regards the second and third and fourth syllables? Theaetetus says no, nothing. So let's pause and talk for a moment. Now there are certain matters, I think, of distinction and of separation in which Socrates' statements, when he says, "And do you at the same time think that a man has knowledge of anything, when he believes the same thing now to be a part of one thing and now a part of something else? Or when he judges that now one thing and now something different belongs to one and the same object?" I think we can accept. Certainly the second statement is easy to accept. When we're thinking about letters and even basic principles, often there are overlap between elements that build up something, some composite, and yet there are differences at the level of the composite. But I think there can be confusion with the first statement, and that is, again, "And do you at the same time think that a man has knowledge of anything when he believes that the same thing now to be a part of one thing and now to be part of something else?" Certainly it is the case that this is possible, just as in the second example, and our explanation of that second example. However, when we're talking about the composite, and we remember the discussion about the Ionian school that all things are in motion, I think in this way there can be a confusion between fundamental differences in category, and to eliminate those boundaries or to make them sufficiently porous that at one time was a solid boundary and a solid way of conceiving that object or thing, whatever, is now completely different. Perhaps it's flipped. And I think that's part of the dangers of language. But that aside, given the context, given what we've been discussing about language and the fundamental principles here of letters and of syllables, it flows and it stays consistent. Now the rebuttal by Theaetetus is that he hasn't forgotten that stage in his learning. But he says, "I don't think people at that stage can be said to have knowledge yet." Now Socrates continues his dialogue. He says, "Now at the time when he does this, he will be writing Theaetetus, not only with correct judgment, but with command of the way through its letters. They must be so whenever he writes them out one after another, in their order." Yes, clearly. And still without knowledge, though with correct judgment, isn't that our view? Theaetetus says yes. Yet possessing an account of it along with his correct judgment, he was writing it, you see, with command of the way through its letters, and we agreed, that is, an account. Theaetetus said true. So here, my friend, we have correct judgment together with an account, which we are not yet entitled to call knowledge. Yes, I'm afraid that's so. So it was only the poor man's dream of gold that we had when we thought we had got the truest account of knowledge. Or is it early days to be harsh? Perhaps this is not the way in which one is to define account. we said that the man who defines knowledge as correct judgment together with an account would choose one of these three meanings for account. Perhaps the last is the one to define it by. Yes, you're right to remind me. There is one possibility still left. The first was a kind of vocal image of thought. The one we have just discussed was the way to the whole through the elements. Now what's your third suggestion? What the majority of people would say, namely, being able to tell some mark by which the object you are asked about differs from all other things. Can you give me an example of such an account of something? Well, take the sun, if you like. You would be satisfied, I imagine, with the answer that it is the brightest of the bodies that move around the earth in the heavens. Oh yes, quite. Now I want you to get a hold of the principle that this illustrates. It is what we were just saying, that if you get a hold of the difference that distinguishes a thing from everything else, then, so some people say, you have got an account of it. On the other hand, so long as it is some common feature that you grasp, your account will be about all those things which have this in common. Now it's interesting here because we can see not only the understanding that the earth is indeed the thing that revolves around the sun, and not the sun around the earth. That is sort of a, in some sense, inconsequential point, but I think to the broader point, to see a falsehood in an explanation of what it means to give true judgment, and to know something, I think is telling about the definition of this account. Not necessarily that the approach is wrong, but rather that humility as a virtue and as a precursor to the exploration into the nature of things is a prerequisite, because there are many things for which that we don't know, and our tools only go so far. We are restricted by the things that they measure. And I'll say that, of course, we do not, even by the restricted nature of our tools, restrict our utilization of them because we fear that they will be incorrect. We must always try to understand and to know within our ability. But I think we also must understand that with our ability comes with our own limitations and our inherent restriction therein of what we may know and what we may establish for ourselves here on the earth. Certainly it is, and it refers to an old religious maxim. From original sin to the acquisition of knowledge to our detriment, to the realization of things that at one time did not bother us, and that this new realization through our reason and rationalization of things perhaps is not necessary for us to be. It's not necessary for us to love one another. But given that the events of the story are written in stone, there is nothing that we can do to return the clock. We are bound by our condition. And I think that the balance and the direction is what is important here, and that for man it is prudent to direct his pursuits and what he chooses to measure always towards the heavens, and not for his own selfish purposes or for some design of some headless body, some corporate institution. unless that institution is oriented in a way that we have just described towards the heavens. But as we were saying before, on the matter of the account, we've spoken in detail about the limitations of the understanding and knowing of something through its component parts. And there are examples that we were given here in this dialogue, but also again the analogy, the metaphor that we've been using, that of the house, which is composed of the fundamental elements of wood, concrete, and perhaps iron, and how that differs from the whole, how that differs from the complex that is made up of those parts that we call the home. And the home is something quite different. Certainly, it requires those fundamental parts to make it whole, to make it a complex, but the thing that it becomes is more than just the sum of its parts. Now, to be fair, it requires the human influence. It requires the heavenly down into the earthly. Now, even the way in which the fundamental elements of the house, let's say, are produced, do have heavenly influences in them. That is, they are manipulated by human beings, by the conscious mind, for a purpose. That there is light of intelligibility that has permeated through the conscious mind from the divine source of all intelligibility into the material object. And as far as that is concerned, we are dealing with a unique example. But we need not get really too far into the weeds in that territory to still understand that the house, the material thing of the house, albeit elevated from its position in nature, serves a greater purpose, a greater human purpose. And I say that again to say that if we are to know that, we are unable to know it through the building materials. Now, the first definition of this account here, it is, in some sense, a prerequisite, but again, it doesn't secure, perhaps nothing really secures, but it moves and it advances one's potential capacity to know, or maybe not capacity, but potential to know, if they engage in the process of verbalizing why they believe that something, or that a judgment should be placed, because at least they have a reason. It doesn't mean this reason is correct, but at least they have one. And if it is bound by reason, then I think, at least in terms of likelihood, barring our example of the coin toss, which a reasonable person would have no solid verbalization to offer, other than they are just guessing because they don't know otherwise what to say or how to make it an appropriate prediction. But a reasonable person in scenarios other than the 50-50, I think, is more likely to make a correct judgment based on that verbalization and that definition of the account. But it certainly is agreeable that both with the fundamental elements and with the verbalization of a judgment, although it does bring us a certain level of understanding, it is not sufficient. And even with the third, there are things for which we can just not know, which require, again, humility. But the third is an important piece of this puzzle, and that is the ability to completely differentiate something, to categorize something, and place firm boundaries around something, to be able to understand what makes it different from something else. Again, in the words of Socrates, that if you get a hold of the difference that distinguishes the thing from everything else, then, so some people say, you will have got an account of it. On the other hand, so long as it is some common feature that you grasp, your account will be about all those things which have this in common. Now, I think within this form of an account, in order for one to get a hold of the differences that distinguish a thing from everything else, one must understand something fundamental about the thing in question. What separates a quarter from a nickel, let's say. And without having to go into too much detail about exactly everything that it would entail, I think we can easily understand that in order to make this difference known to us or intelligible, we have to go through some sort of process by which we make this differentiation. We have to identify something. We have to single out some characteristic. We have to understand that there are certain things about the two objects that are fundamentally different that cause them to be two different things. There's a hard line between them. Now we can also perform the experiment of their likeness. But just as in the case of the house, just because there are similar elements, let's just assume for the moment that they are made out of the same materials, same elements. We can go through that process of determining its likeness, but this would not afford us with a distinction between the two. For if we limited ourselves only to its likeness, we would not be able to give an account about the thing itself, and to make a judgment of the thing separate from something else. Now that, of course, is perhaps something that needs not explanation. But again, the degree to which we are able to surround something, whether it is an object or a concept, with characteristics that define it, which would include its fundamental elements, but also the things that characterize the whole, as in the case of the house and the home, we are able to get an accurate image. We can carve this into our wax figure. We can put this pigeon into our aviary. And when we retrieve it, when we look upon our ball of wax, when we retrieve our pigeon from this aviary, it's easy. It's readily retrievable. It's readily recognizable. It is distinct. It is known. And therefore our judgments, when we make them, they are more apt to be true judgments instead of false judgments. Now Theaetetus says, I see. I think it's very good to call this kind of thing an account. Socrates says, then if a man with correct judgment about any one of the things that are grasps in addition its difference from the rest, he has become a knower of the things he was a judger of before. That's our present position, anyway, says Theaetetus. Well, at this point, Theaetetus, as regards what we are saying, I'm for all the world like a man looking at a shadow painting. When I'm close up to it, I can't take it in the least, though when I stood well back from it, it appeared to me to have some meaning. Now there's a footnote here. It says the pictorial technique referred to as skiagraphia seems to have been one which depended on contrast between light and shade to create an appearance of form and volume. A more familiar comparison for modern readers would be Pointilliste painting by Seurat. So this is a painting that most of us will know one way or another, even if we're not all that interested in art, or at least the style. So there is a famous painting about a bunch of people that are in formal dress. They're at a park with a lake or a river, and they're all sort of relaxing by this place. The painting itself is made up of these small pixels, I guess we can say, for the lack of a better word. Where close up the pixels, they're distorted. They don't really seem to have any complex. There are the individual elements in and of themselves that make the whole difficult to see and differentiate. But when we back up enough, then we can start to see the forms. We can see the human being, we can see the landscape, etc. Now Theaetetus says, how's that? I'll see if I can explain. Suppose I have formed a correct judgment about you. If I can grasp your account in addition, I know you, but if not, I'm merely judging you. Yes. And an account was to be a matter of expounding your differentness. That is so. Then when I was merely judging, my thought failed to grasp any point of difference between you and the rest of mankind? Apparently. What I had in mind, it seems, was some common characteristic, something that belongs no more to you than to anybody else. Yes, that must be so. Then tell me, in heaven's name, how, if that was so, did it come about that you were the object of my judgment and nobody else? Suppose my thought is that this is Theaetetus, one who is a human being, and has a nose, and eyes, and a mouth, and so on, through the whole list of limbs. Will this thought cause me to be thinking that Theaetetus rather than Theodorus, or of the proverbial remotest Mysian? Theaetetus says, no, how could it? But suppose I think not merely of the one with nose and eyes, but of the one with a snub nose and prominent eyes. Shall I even then be judging you any more than myself or anyone who is like that? Theaetetus says, not at all. It will not, I take it, be a Theaetetus who is judged in my mind until this snub-nosedness of yours has left imprinted and established in me a record that is different in some way from the other snub-nosednesses I have seen. And so with the other details of your makeup. And this will remind me, if I meet you tomorrow, and make me judge correctly about you. Theaetetus says that's perfectly true. Then correct judgment must also be concerned with the differentness of what it is about. So it seems, anyway. then what more might this adding an account to correct judgment be, if, on the one hand, it means that we must take another judgment about the way in which a thing differs from the rest of things, we are required to do something very absurd. Theaetetus says, how is that? Because we already have a correct judgment about the way a thing differs from other things, and we are then directed to add a correct judgment about the way it differs from other things. At any rate, the way a roller goes round for a pestle, or anything else proverbial, would be nothing compared with such directions. They might be more justly called a matter of the blind leading the blind. To tell us to add what we already have in order to come to know what we are judging about bears a generous resemblance to the behavior of a man benighted. Now, Socrates is making a subtle point here, and at first glance it's difficult exactly to understand how this is different than having judgment, or the term that is judgment, and the account that we have been talking about, and the definition of the account of this differentiation, separation, to distinguish something from another, how this doesn't permeate all levels. Now Socrates, when he says, because we already have correct judgment about the way a thing differs from other things, this is a crucial point to the subtlety, I think, because it's possible that it implies that there is something inherent about the nature of the judgment that has the ability to distinguish and to differentiate on some level. And where the account comes in, perhaps this is something that is, if it is necessary for further differentiation. Because we already have a correct judgment about the way a thing differs from other things, and we are then directed to add a correct judgment about the way it differs from other things. The way a roller goes round, or a pestle, or anything else proverbial, would be nothing compared with such directions. They might be more justly called a matter of the blind leading the blind. To tell us to add what we already have in order to come to know what we are judging about bears a generous resemblance to the behavior of a man benighted. Benighted means, sort of overcome by darkness, or wallowing in a state of ignorance. So let's continue reading, and we'll come back to some of these points. Theaetetus says, whereas if, on the other hand, what else were you going to suggest when you started this inquiry just now? Well, if adding an account means that we are required to get to know the differentness, not merely judge it, this most splendid of our accounts of knowledge turns out to be a very amusing affair. For getting to know, of course, is acquiring knowledge, isn't it? Yes. So it seems the answer to the question, what is knowledge, will be correct judgment accompanied by knowledge of the differences. For this is what we are asked to understand by the addition of an account. Theaetetus says apparently so. So if I'm not mistaken, this confirms my suspicions earlier about the subtlety of judgment. Because here we have correct judgment is accompanied by knowledge of the differences. He says, "For this is what we are asked to understand by the addition of an account." Socrates says, "And it is surely just silly to tell us, when we are trying to discover what knowledge is, that it is correct judgment accompanied by knowledge, whether of differences or of anything else. And so, Theaetetus, knowledge is neither perception nor true judgment, nor an account added to true judgment." Theaetetus says, "It seems now not." "Well now, dear lad, are we still pregnant, still in labor with any thoughts about knowledge, or have we been delivered of them all? As far as I'm concerned, Socrates, you've made me say far more than ever was in me, heaven knows. Well then, our art of midwifery tells us that all of these offerings are wind eggs, and not worth bringing up?" Theaetetus says, "Undoubtedly." "And so, Theaetetus, if ever in the future you should attempt to conceive or should succeed in conceiving other theories, they will be better ones as a result of this inquiry. And if you remain barren, your companions will find you gentler and less tiresome. You will be modest and not think you know what you don't know. This is all my art can achieve, nothing more. I do not know any of these things that other men know, the great and inspired men of today and yesterday. But this art of midwifery my mother and I had allotted to us by God. She to deliver women, and I to deliver men that are young, and generous in spirit, all that have any beauty. And now I must go to the king's porch to meet the indictment that Meletus has brought against me. But let us meet here again in the morning, Theodorus." Now that concludes the end of the dialogue of Theaetetus. I think some closing remarks are in order, so that we can establish exactly how this concluded, and what we can say of knowledge, and what we have benefited from. I think many times in the dialogues, the endings are rather unsatisfactory. But just as Socrates said here, it's a key point. He says, "And so, Theaetetus, if ever in the future you should attempt to conceive or should succeed in conceiving other theories, they will be better ones as a result of this inquiry." I think that's true of many different things. The process by which we have undergone is not in vain. We have discovered things about things that we had not known before, even if the object of our exploration has not necessarily been achieved 100%. It has been achieved in terms of moving closer to. In the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms, there is this continual process of moving towards and moving around. But just as there is something in front of us that seems to be so fundamental that we can't see, we know it's there because it is something that we must navigate around. And not only is it something that we must navigate around, it is something that we are drawn towards. It is something that we are of, in a certain sense. This knowledge and knowing and understanding, the light of the conscious mind that is fed by another source of light, of consciousness, of some divine order and logos. And so the exact cause of knowing perhaps is difficult for man to say, but his exploration into these matters, assuming genuine, I think, is fruitful in and of itself for his experience and for his expansion of virtue, for his humility. for his sanity. So let's return before we conclude this series with a recap of what this ending really means. Now, at the conclusion of our last progression, our last few steps forward, and that was the third definition of our account, we said that of this account, if you get a hold of the differences that distinguish a thing from everything else, then, so some people say, you will have got an account of it. On the other hand, so long as it is some common feature that you grasp, your account will be about all those things which have this in common. So I think it's important here to understand that there are two ends to this spectrum of the account. You know, it's interesting. Often in biblical exploration and in philosophy, you hear about the things such as the vertical and the horizontal. Sometimes they seemingly make sense 100% of the time. And in the case of the vertical, I think of the bottom of that vertical being fundamental elements and the emerging characteristics that come out of them as we ascend that vertical hierarchy, let's say. And at the top of it, we have more of the emanatory. We have the known that comes down. The known that comes down to meet the emergence. So it's the heaven and earth. The earth is the thing that emerges, right? The conscious thing, the consciousness that has emerged from earthly matter, eventually meets, or rather I should say, the biological material that emerges from the earthly material eventually finds consciousness, and at that point it meets heaven. And that is the beginning of humanity, in a certain sense. Now, human beings and their anatomical and, I hesitate to say behaviorally modern, because if they are behaviorally modern, certainly they would be endowed by this level of consciousness that we're talking about. And I think we've mentioned this before, whether it be from a slow and gradual march towards the light of what is the conscious mind, or if it is a phenomena that is fairly sudden, like a strike of a lightning bolt into the human mind. Regardless of that circumstance, the fact is we can put a distinction and a boundary around that and say, this is the point in history, or this is the point when it happened that man found heaven. And this is the vertical. And so I mentioned this vertical and horizontal because in this example here, we have a similar sort of thing. We have two ends of a spectrum. On one hand, you can get a hold of the differences that distinguish a thing from everything else, thereby making it individual. You can break it down into its elements in a certain respect. You can also understand it at different levels. You can break it down into its elements. Its elements can make it be the thing that differs from another thing, or you can examine it at the level of the complex, at the level of the whole, that make it different from another complex. And then, by the same token, the other side of that spectrum, on the other hand, so long as it is some common feature that you grasp, your account will be about all those things which have this in common. And so this is more of the unitary type approach. Now this really does remind me of that vertical relationship. We have, on one hand, the breaking down of one into many. That is the identification of the many different differences that make up the thing that is the whole, that does differentiate from other things. And in itself, that differentiation is the separation between individual things and other individual things. And then on the other hand, again, we have the account in which we have the identification of things that unite things together. And our categories are they're not destroyed, but we can see how the categories interact and are related with one another. Now it's hard not to think about the cultural instability that we're currently experiencing, a cultural contagion that I think is certainly in the many years to come, assuming we get past all of this, looking back on it, and perhaps listening to these words, I think probably would be quite surreal. This would be quite the trove of information and of reflection on the way of the world in 2023, whether it be from increasing nominalism, that is this fakery and charade that institutions play so that they can maintain their own form of order outside of what people would wish for themselves and for their fellow citizens. We have within ourselves profound confusion. We swing so far and so wildly in different directions that on one hand we are desperate for this unity, and on the other we are desperate to understand and to keep apart people and separate them into differences, and even to celebrate these differences. And in so doing, the celebration breaks all form of unity. And so it is this constant cycle of destruction and of, again, nominalism. A name only, but the name itself has no meaning. It is the destruction of meaning. It is the destruction of identity in the protection and the liberation of one's own self-identity. That's how bizarre it is. It is the image of the snake eating its own tail. It is inherently a suicidal, poor religion. Now, to return to what we were talking about here, we were talking about how we know things. We're talking about the third aspect of our account and the two aspects therein. Now, our central focus is of knowing. And Socrates says the things that are grasped in addition to its differences from the rest, when these are done by man, he has become a knower of the thing when he was a judger before. And in this characterization, the judgment is not the thing that does the differentiation. Then Socrates makes the point that when he's looking close up at his argument, he can't see at all, he can't make any sense of it. But when he moves out, away from his close-up analysis, then he comes to understand a broader complex. It's almost as if when we were talking about the house and the home, the elements of themselves are not identifiable as the home, but they are a requirement to produce the complex. The complex of the house. I mean, the house is different, even just the house. Outside of the family and all of the things that are inside the house, the rooms that fulfill specific purposes and all this. The house is different from the lumber that arrives on the site. And when we stare at the lumber, we're not seeing a house. Or when we go into the basement, perhaps, and we stare closely at the concrete or at an iron support beam, we're not looking at the totality of the house. It's difficult to see exactly what we're looking at. And so we take a correct judgment about somebody. And we also consider the account, which we now know is to be some differentiation. So we say that we know the person. Now, if we did not have this account, it would just be as though we were unable to grasp between extremely fundamental characteristics. Now, the separation from the account and the judgment is a bizarre one, because surely it comes from the same mind. But what does it exactly mean? Is this a level of our attentiveness? Is this the mark that we aim for? Surely we must pass by people every day, perhaps on a busy street, and we don't really choose to differentiate among them. In this way, our attentiveness seems to indicate to us that all of this information is not necessary, and that they are not needed. An account is not needed to be given to them. But it seems strange if we are to say a judgment, and if we are to say, perhaps, this is not said in the dialogue, but a differentiation of judgment. Perhaps it's the speed in which we make a conclusion about something. Perhaps rather instantly, we still are able to differentiate people. But if we are not attending to the people themselves, but are just aware that people are there, then it's our characterization and our understanding, our knowing in this case, is just based on some judgment that people are there. Now, the irony is that the definition of judgment is the ability to make considered decisions or come to sensible conclusions. Discernment, acumen, and shrewdness are all synonyms. Common sense, this is another one. Now, when I read common sense, this brings up the thought of the American Revolution. There's a book written, Common Sense. Common sense involves common infrastructure. It involves common belief. I can see what Socrates means when he says that it's difficult to see close up, but when he steps back, he can see the picture. It's difficult to see on the scale of the individual how exactly the belief and the individual elements produce the complex and the whole, which can be seen in and of itself as something quite different perceptually. Then when I was merely judging, my thought failed to grasp any point of difference between you and the rest of mankind. Now, unlike my example of walking in the crowd of people and purposefully limiting one's attention and combining the surrounding environment into a single category for efficiency's purpose is different than what we are seeing here. This is a person that is examining one individual and is unable to distinguish, to form that judgment about the individual and the rest. And so the reasonable question is, well, if that is actually true, then how is it even possible that you were the object of my judgment and nobody else? Now, I think we have to recognize here a bit of a mathematical equation. That is, we have been talking about judgment plus the account, or the judgment and then the account comes into play. It is now account before judgment. It may seem as a rather trivial distinction, but I think it's extremely important. Because the judgment, it seems to be, in this way of thinking, is the tipping of one's opinion towards one direction or another. Now, the account is the thing that gives the force to that tipping. But at the same time, well, I should say the account is the thing that gives the force to the true judgment, because we can have false judgments. And so therefore, if there is a judgment without this account, it is this just tipping based on what? And I think that this is the question. Well, what is this judgment based on if the account is coming after? And that the account is the thing that provides true judgment. And then if that the account is the thing that does the differentiating, then how is it immediately I understand Theaetetus? I've taken into account many different pieces of him. And I think it has to do with attention. There's something inherent in attention that provides for an account number one, and then some judgment, and then an account number two. Now, that's my own personal opinion. Suppose my thought is that this is Theaetetus, one who is a human being, and has a nose, eyes, mouth, and so on through the whole of list of limbs. Will this thought cause me to be thinking of Theaetetus rather than of Theodorus, or of the proverbial remotest Mysian? And the crucial point here is that it will not, I take it, be Theaetetus who is judged in my mind until. Right, so the judgment has not come about until some differentiation has taken place. And this goes into the snub-nosedness or the particular qualities of Theaetetus. And this goes more to my hypothesis about the account number one prior to judgment. Then judgment, and then account number two. It is a bit of a scientific process. It is the exploration of information. One has to understand the topic that they're interested in. They go to the literature, they read it, then they form an hypothesis. They have an account before they form a judgment. Now they have a judgment, they form another account by doing research of a more practical kind, and then they make another judgment. And through this filter, it becomes easier to identify what is true. Socrates says, then correct judgment also must be concerned with the differentness of what it is about. Now that statement, it's how do we say that that is different from what we were saying? Then correct judgment also must be concerned with the differentness of what it is about. What is this differentness that he is talking about? It could be the differentness of the object. He says, then what more might this adding an account to correct judgment B if, on the one hand, it means that we must make another judgment about the way in which things differ from the rest of things. We are being required to do something very absurd. And his reason for that is because we already have a correct judgment about the way a thing differs from other things, and we are then directed to add a correct judgment about the way it differs from other things. At any rate, the way a roller goes round or a pestle or anything else proverbial would be nothing compared with such directions. They might be more justly called a matter of the blind leading the blind. To tell us to add what we already have in order to come to know what we are judging about bears a generous resemblance to the behavior of a man benighted. So there's something deeper here that I missed, I think, on the first pass. Now, it's going to take me a bit, I think, to bring this in and bring it home to a central point, but I will attempt to do so. So we have this correct judgment. Who are we to say that now, even if we have this correct judgment, we must give it? Perhaps I should say it this way. We have a correct judgment based on a process of differentiation and distinction prior to making the judgment, and it has led us to make the correct judgment. Now, why would it be the case that we would suggest now that it needs another account? Who are we to say that given our understanding and our definition now of knowing, that is, a judgment that is accompanied by an account, this account being, in Socrates' words, if you get a hold of the difference that distinguishes a thing from everything else, then, so some people say, you will have gotten account of it. Why then must this be the case? Who are we to say it? We who are trying to determine what knowledge is. If we are wholly ignorant of knowledge, and we have not come to a satisfactory conclusion, that we cannot make this assertion. It would be the blind leading the blind, as he says. Now, this reference to the roller and pestle are obviously used as a metaphor, but they illustrate the point about the nature of knowledge and understanding. Now, this roller and pestle are given in relation to the idea of giving direction or definitions, suggesting that if someone were to provide a direction for a particular subject, such as divining knowledge without having an understanding of it, it would be like the roller going around or the pestle pounding without a clear purpose or direction. And so perhaps what is lingering in my mind, but what I've perhaps hesitated and have not yet said, is I think that this points to the divine logos. This points to God. That although we are in the image of this divine logos, to attribute the lack of conscious intent or understanding the broader context would be in spite of this divine logos. Because it's just then objects going through their motions without any deeper understanding or purpose. Because we don't ourselves really understand. Now, providing definitions, directions, without the deeper grasp of something is inefficient. Now, it doesn't mean that we haven't gone anywhere, like I've said before. He says, to tell us to add what we already have in order to come to know what we are judging about bears a generous resemblance to the behavior of a man benighted. This is the blind leading the blind. This is a man that I'm reminded of like sort of an overeducated. There was a story when I was in graduate school given by one of the professors. He was an anatomy and physiology professor. He had his own side business, but he told the story after he graduated college that his grandparents owned a farm, and I guess he studied biology and things about agriculture and farming, and he went back home after he graduated, and he brought all of his scientific expertise, and he convinced his grandparents to change something fundamental about the way that they were doing things. And it ultimately affected, to a very significant degree, the output of their crop. And I think this is kind of similar to what is being said here. This is a person who denies the true judgment of somebody else because he feels as though he has the true knowledge. In this case, he was the benighted individual. Socrates says, if adding an account means that we are required to get to know the differences, not merely judge it, this most splendid of our accounts of knowledge turns out to be a very amusing affair. For getting to know, of course, is acquiring knowledge, isn't it? So it seems the answer to the question, what is knowledge, will be correct judgment accompanied by knowledge of the differentness. For this is what we are asked to understand by the addition of an account. And so I think this is kind of similar to account number 1 and account number 2. This is the judgment based on some information initially, and then that accompanied by the knowledge of the differences. He says, and it is surely just silly to tell us, when we are trying to discover what knowledge is, that it is correct judgment accompanied by knowledge, whether of differences or of anything else. And so, Theaetetus, knowledge is neither perception nor true judgment, nor an account added to true judgment. So, rather non-definitive ending. We end with silliness. We end with understanding of our own ignorance. But I think the surrendering and the humility to that divine logos is sort of the point, because this is knowledge and understanding. And so at a certain point we have faith in something that we just don't know, because knowing itself seems to be, understanding knowing itself seems to be difficult for us. You know, it's funny, virtue in these principles. Humility is one of those things, we spent numerous hours, numerous pages, thinking we were on the right track, thinking that we had the answer, and now we were set. We could be comfortable. We could rest easy within it. But it was never really the case. Now we explored things that were true. We explored things that were reasonable. But in the end, there are perhaps inherent limitations by certain approaches to knowing. And that is not to say that there is no truth and that there is no knowing. There is. But in order to complete the circle, there has to be something that's a little bit more than our attempts to define it. And so with all the various analogies and the thought that we've put into this, I think that I would say that I have benefited from it. I benefited from certainly being put into place over and over, being provided this humility, but also introducing and reiterating the process of critical thinking, and the process by which we can deduce and come to know certain things. Our various analogies, from the archer to the wax, to the aviary, to the house and the home. I think all of these are useful in everyday life. Certainly something that I will carry with me for as long as my memory will hold it. And so this marks the end of the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus. We will continue next time with, I think we are going to pause on Plato for a little while. We will return to what I consider and what feels most like home, whereas this is sort of what feels like the building of the house. The home is the scripture, it is the Bible, and we will pick up with the book of Proverbs next time.